Upon the death of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas became the tetrarch over Galilee. He was a weak and miserable leader. This is the story of how he took over his brother's wife and will eventually seal that adulterous relationship with the blood of God's servant, who fearlessly warned him to give up that evil union. Cruel and crafty like his father, yet Antipas was a very weak unlike him. He will become a governor whose reign will be characterized by infidelity, wickedness, and murder. He would be so weak, even to say no to a murderous demand, and his unlawful marriage will lead him into such act. It was always the manner of the princes and leader who owe their existence to the Roman intervention to pay frequent visit to the emperor at Rome. Possibly during one of the visits to his brother Philip, Antipas became entangled by the snares of Herodias, Philip's wife. The woman must have given him sumptuous hospitality mixed with seductive signals. He repaid the hospitality he had received by carrying her off from his brother. Herodias, being the daughter of Aristobulus, was not only the sister-in-law, but also the niece of Antipas. She had already borne to her husband a daughter who had already grown up. Antipas had himself been long married, so neither he nor Herodias were young enough to plead the poor excuse of youthful passion. The sole temptation on his side was an impotent sensuality, on hers an extravagant ambition. She preferred an adulterous and incestuous life at the palace that lived with her husband, who was not a governor. Antipas must have been compelled to make a pledge that he will divorce his wife upon his return. But series of events from that moment will unfold for Herod Antipas, which will only culminate in his death years after. Herodias from that moment became the evil genius of his house. The people were scandalized and outraged. Family members and concerned friends must have been very embittered by what the governor had done. His wife must have been very angry also and may have probably left the marriage. Afterward, evil and iniquity will begin to multiply, and the adulterous union had to be cemented with a prophet's blood. The beautiful hall of his sumptuous palace must have succeeded perhaps in shutting out the deep murmurs and indignation of his subjects. But there was one voice which reached him and agitated his conscience, and that voice will not be silence. It was the voice of a fiery preacher and prophet, John the Baptist. John condemned his evil act and was summoned before the weak, godless ruler. And like the new Elijah before Ahab, clothed in his desert raiment, the hairy cloak and leathern girdle, stood fearless before the incestuous king. His words, the simple words of truth and justice, the reasonings about righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, fell like flakes of fire on his hard and icy conscience. But there was one thing which he would not do, perhaps persuaded himself that he could not do, and that was give up the guilty love which mastered him, or dismiss the haughty, imperious woman who ruled his life after ruining his peace. "It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife," was the blunt declaration of the dauntless prophet. And though time after time he might be led over those splendid floors, pale and wasted with imprisonment and disappointed hope, yet though he well knew that it kindled against him an implacable enmity, and doomed him to a fresh remand to his solitary cell, he never hesitated to face the flushed and angry Herod with same word. Nor did he spare his stern judgment on all the other crimes and follies of Herod's life. Other men, even men otherwise great and good, have had very smooth words for the sins of princes, but in the fiery soul of the Baptist, strengthened into noblest exercise by the long asceticism of the wilderness, there was no dread of human royalty, and no compromise with exalted sin. And when courage and holiness and purity thus stood to rebuke the lustful meanness of a servile and corrupted soul, can we wonder if even among his glittering courtiers and reckless men-at-arms, the king cowered conscience-stricken before the fettered prisoner? But John knew how little trust can be placed in a soul that has been eaten away by a besetting sin. And since Christ, to whom he had borne witness beyond Jordan, wrought no miracle of power for his deliverance, it is not probable that he looked for any passage out of his dungeon, save through the grave and gate of death. He stood as a witness of truth, even unto death. He was not willing to compromise the word of truth, even before a ruler. His devotion was to the living God alone. Like Elijah, who faced idolatrous Ahab and locked up the heaven till the nation fell before the Almighty God, John stood as a lone voice against the madness of Antipas. Elijah himself suffered hardship through the years of famine, but endured to see righteousness established and the name of Jehovah glorified. But the second Elijah had to pay the price for taking a stand for righteousness with his own blood. The timidity of Herod Antipas was not able to protect John from the concentrated venom of an adulteress's hate. But at last, what she had failed to gain by passionate influence, she succeeded in gaining by subtle fraud. She knew well that even from his prison, the voice of John might be more powerful than all the influences of her fading beauty, and might succeed at last in tearing from her forehead that guilty crown. But she watched her opportunity, and was not long in gaining her end. The Herodian princes, imitating the luxurious example of their great prototypes, the Roman emperors, were fond of magnificent banquets and splendid anniversaries. Among others, they had adopted the heathen fashion of birthday celebrations, and Antipas on his birthday prepared a banquet for his courtiers and generals and Galilean nobles. The wealth of the Herods, the expensive architecture of their numerous palaces, their universal tendency to extravagant display make it certain that nothing would be wanting to such a banquet which wealth or royalty could procure. And there is enough to show that it was on the model of those sumptuous parties and gorgeous feasts. But Herodias had craftily provided the king with an unexpected and exciting pleasure, the spectacle of which would be sure to enrapture such guests as his. Dancers and dancing women were at that time in great request. The passion for witnessing these too often indecent and degrading occasion was often what must leaders and nobles clamor for. It was an opportunity for the ruling class to meet together and have some pleasures together. A luxurious feast of that period was not regarded as complete unless it closed with some gross pantomimic representation, and doubtless Herod had adopted the evil fashion of his day. But he had not anticipated for his guests the rare luxury of seeing a princess, his own niece, a granddaughter of Herod the Great, a descendant of Simon the high priest, a princess who afterwards became the wife of a tetrarch and the mother of a king, honoring them by degrading herself into a scenic dancer. It was a feat that must be achieved at all cost for Herodias, even if it means selling off her own daughter to the ravaging eyes of a lustful and immoral spectators. And yet when the banquet was over, when the guests were full of meat and flushed with wine, Salome herself, the daughter of Herodias, then in the prime of her young and lustrous beauty, came in before their intoxicated guests. She came in with her serpentine appeal, revealing the different contours of her body. She was on a serious assignment, and she has come due for a mission that even the king was unaware of. She has received instructions earlier from her adulterous mother, and must stick to the plan. She was not aware of her mother's intention, but she, like her mother, care less of whatever the outcome will be. The timing was planned. Wait till they are drunk with pleasure. She came in and danced, and pleased Herod and them that sat at meat with him. And he, in the delirium of his drunken approval, swore to this degraded girl in the presence of his guests that he would give her anything for which she asked, even to the half of his kingdom. Herodias sitting beside him must have also been the brain behind such extravagant and careless utterance. Exactly as planned, with excitement, she ran to her mother, who was ready for her final stroke against the prophet. She had waited for this moment. She came to her mother and said, "What shall I ask?" It was exactly what Herodias expected, and she might have asked for robes or jewels or palaces or whatever such a woman loves. But to a mind like hers, revenge was sweeter than wealth or pride. and we may imagine with what fierce malice she hissed out the unhesitating answer, "The head of John the Baptist." And coming in before the king immediately with haste, Salome exclaimed, "My wish is that you give me here, immediately, on a dish, the head of John the Baptist." Her indecent haste, her hideous petition show that she shared the furies of her mother's race. Did she think that in that infamous period, and among those infamous guests, her petition would be received with a burst of laughter? Did she hope to kindle their merriment to a still higher pitch by the sense of the delightful wickedness involved in a young and beautiful girl, asking, nay, imperiously demanding, that then and there, on one of the golden dishes which graced the board, should be given into her own hands the gory head of the prophet whose words had made 1,000 bold hearts quail? If so, she was disappointed. The tetrarch, at any rate, was plunged into grief by her request. It more than did away with the pleasure of her disgraceful dance. It was a bitter termination of his birthday feast. Fear, policy, remorse, superstition, even whatever poor spark of better feeling remained unquenched under the dense white ashes of a heart consumed by evil passions, all made him shrink in disgust from this sudden execution. He must have felt that he had been duped out of his own will by the cunning scheme of his unrelenting partner. If a single touch of manliness had been left in him, he would have refused the request as one which did not fall either under the letter or the spirit of his oath, since the life of one cannot be made the gift to another. Or he would have boldly declared at once that if such was her choice, his oath was more honored by being broken than by being kept. But a despicable pride and fear of man prevailed over his better impulses. More afraid of the criticisms of his guests than of the future torment of such conscience as was left in him, he immediately sent an executioner to the prison, which in all probability was not far from the banqueting hall. And so, at the bidding of a dissolute coward, and to please the loathy fancies of a shameless girl, the axe fell, and the head of the noblest of the prophets was shorn away. In darkness and in secrecy, the scene was enacted, and if any sort their lips were sealed. But the executioner emerged into the light, carrying by the hair that noble head. And then and there, in all the ghastliness of recent death, it was placed upon a dish from the royal table. The lustful dancing girl received it and carried the hideous burden to her mother. Let us hope that the awful spectacle haunted the souls of both henceforth till death. Herodias became a symbol of adultery and wickedness. Like Jezebel, who pursued Elijah to cut off his head as well, they also stand behind royalty and from there sponsor all forms of idolatry and wickedness. They are always looking for weak and vulnerable kings whom they will entice, and from that position of authority work all manner of atrocities. Herod Antipas was as weak as Ahab, who could not stop or condemn the evil acts of Jezebel. The devil usually placed these women around the place of authority in order to use them in executing his wicked counsels. What did she do with the head of John? She must have preserved it in order to continuously mock the prophet. From henceforth, no one will dare talk about her adulterous and incestuous relationship with Antipas. The whole scenario must have remained a thorn to the conscience of Antipas. He will hear of another prophet who was doing greater works than John, and his conscience will immediately awaken, and he will declare, "This is John the Baptist whom I beheaded. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these mighty works are wrought by him." The echo of a troubled conscience, an act that will forever torment him. What started as an ungodly relationship had become a vehicle that will turn the king into a murderer. He could have listened and repented and put away the wicked woman. He could have resisted the request of Salome, but he yielded as a coward. Sin and stubbornness will always lead a man to a path of destruction and doom. Herod will know from this single act that the woman she took in was a beast. Their relationship will not be the same henceforth. He will have to live in fear with this woman and her daughter. She has shown the governor how far she can go in wickedness, and she will be feared from henceforth. The Word of God shows us her picture in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 20. This is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth, and says, I have done no wickedness. And also warned us about her in chapter 7, verse 25 to 27. Do not let your heart turn to her ways or stray into her paths. Many are the victims she has brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. She reduces a man to a piece of bread, and anyone who will please God must flee from her. Like Joseph, we must flee even though it meant going to prison. And today, social media have opened more doors to the adulteresses, as they can unleash their venom from the comfort of their rooms and entangle many through pornography, masturbation, and all forms of immorality. The Bible gave us one secret to continuous victory. Flee also youthful lusts, but follow righteousness, faith, charity, peace, with them that call on the Lord out of a pure heart.